So here is something that was never supposed to happen. Camilla, the Queen of England, the woman who sits beside the king at every state dinner and every public ceremony this country has, was photographed on a private yacht in the south of France, doing the one thing that every advisor she has ever hired has told her she must never ever do. She was relaxed. She was unguarded. And she was surrounded by the kind of company that no sitting queen should be keeping, while her husband's family is holding itself together with both hands. And that is not the part that matters. The part that matters is what happened after those photographs were sent to 3 different media outlets on the same Tuesday morning in May. Because those photographs did not land in a newsroom and sit there waiting for a legal review. They moved fast. And by the time the palace press office had even drafted its first response, somebody inside Kensington had already made a phone call that changed the entire shape of what came next. That phone call did not come from the king. It did not come from any senior advisor. It came from William. And what William did in the 72 hours that followed those photographs becoming public is something that the institution has been trying to keep quiet ever since. I am going to walk you through all of it. Every photograph, every phone call, every silence that lasted a beat too long. And by the end of this, you are going to understand why those yacht photos were not just an embarrassment. They were the match that lit something William had been building for months. But first, you need to understand something about the woman in those photographs. Because what Camilla was doing on that yacht is not just a story about bad judgment. It is a story about a pattern that goes back years. A pattern that one woman understood better than anyone alive and did not live long enough to see the rest of the world understand it too. If you want to follow this story as it keeps unfolding, you already know where the subscribe button is, so go ahead and hit it now. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family. The records, the press briefings, the reporting that got buried before anybody finished asking questions. And what you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them. Stay to the end, because that last page is where this whole thing lands. Section 2. The wound beneath it all. Before we get to those photographs and what William did about them, you need to understand the wound that sits underneath all of it. Because this is not the first time that photographs taken in private have torn through this family like a blade. And the last time it happened, it did not just cause damage, it destroyed a life. In 1997, Diana was being chased. That is the simple version. The longer version is that she had been chased for years. Not just by photographers with long lenses, but by an institution that had decided she was more dangerous outside the gates than she had ever been inside them. Every private moment she tried to build for herself was treated as public property. Every holiday, every friendship, every quiet afternoon with her boys was something that somebody, somewhere, believed they had the right to photograph, print, and profit from. And Diana knew it. She knew that the cameras would follow her wherever she went, because the cameras had never stopped following her from the day she was 19 years old and stepped out of a car in a skirt that the sun came through. She had spent almost 2 decades living inside a system that sold her image to the world and then blamed her when the world could not stop looking. Every photograph that was taken of her without her knowledge was treated by the palace as her fault. Every headline that ran with her face on it was evidence, according to the people who were supposed to be protecting her, that she had invited the attention she was drowning in. Think about that for a second. The institution did not protect Diana from the cameras. It used the cameras to manage her, and when she tried to manage them on her own terms, it punished her for being too visible, too available, too willing to exist in the public eye without permission. The paradox she lived inside was designed to be unwinnable. She was told to be the face of the monarchy, and then criticized for having a face that the world could not stop looking at. She understood, in a way that almost nobody around her was willing to admit out loud, that the photographs were never really about her. They were about what she represented. They were about the gap between the fairy tale the palace had sold to the public and the truth that she carried in her body every single day. And when she died in that tunnel in Paris, with a photographer's flash still burning in the rearview mirror of a car that was driving too fast because it was being followed too closely, that gap did not close. It just went underground. It went into the bodies of two small boys who were told to walk behind a coffin in front of 1,000,000 strangers. It went into the memory of a nation that understood, even if it could not put it into words at the time, that something had been taken from all of them. And it went into the bones of a palace that spent the next 25 years trying to make sure that nothing like that ever happened again. Except it kept happening. Not in tunnels and not with the same horrifying finality, but in quieter ways. In photographs taken without permission. In stories placed by people who should have been protecting instead of profiting. In a system that learned the wrong lesson from Diana's death. The lesson that the problem was the exposure and not the betrayal. And the woman who benefited most from that wrong lesson, the woman who stepped into the space that Diana's death had opened up and filled it with silence and ceremony and the careful management of her own image, was the same woman who was photographed on that yacht in the south of France last May. Camilla, and that is where this story begins to matter. Because when those yacht photographs reached the press, they did not just show a queen behaving badly. They opened a door that the palace had spent decades keeping shut. They showed the public, in color and in detail, the version of Camilla that Diana had been trying to tell them about for years. The version that nobody wanted to believe because believing it meant admitting that the fairy tale had not just failed once. It had been rebuilt on top of the failure, and the woman standing at the center of the rebuild was the same woman who had caused the failure in the first place. And the person who understood that better than anyone, the person who had inherited not just his mother's grief, but her understanding of how that institution uses and discards the people inside it, was William. Section 3. The slow build now here is where you have to slow down, because the sequence of events that led to those yacht photographs becoming public is the part that makes everything else make sense. In early April, Camilla had requested what the palace calls a personal engagement break. That is the official language for a senior royal stepping away from public duties for a period of time, usually for health reasons or family obligations. The request was approved without any particular fuss. It happens. Senior royals take breaks, the machine continues without them, and the public barely notices. But what was unusual about this particular break was where Camilla chose to spend it. She did not go to Ray Mill, the country house in Wiltshire, where she has always retreated when the schedule becomes too heavy. She did not stay at Clarence House. She did not go to Balmoral or Sandringham or any of the dozen properties that the institution maintains specifically for moments like this. She went to the south of France. She boarded a yacht owned by a family that the palace press office has spent years insisting she has no significant personal relationship with. And she did it without a single member of her usual security detail. I am going to hold that detail back for a minute because it matters more than you think it does right now. The security detail, or rather the absence of it, is the thread that connects everything that came after. The yacht was a 60-meter vessel anchored off the coast near Saint-Tropez. It belonged to people who move in circles that the palace has always been very careful to keep at arm's length in public, even when the private connections run deep. The vessel had been refitted the previous year. It had a crew of 14. It had a private deck that was screened from view on 3 sides by tinted glass panels that would have blocked any photograph taken from the shore. Camilla was there for 5 days. She was photographed on the 3rd. Now I need you to understand something about those 5 days, because the timeline matters. On the first day, Camilla boarded the yacht at a private marina, and the only people who saw her arrive were the crew and the guests who were already on board. No press, no photographers, no security standing on the dock in dark suits looking obvious. She arrived the way a private citizen arrives at a private vessel, and that should have been the first warning to anyone paying attention. Because Camilla is not a private citizen. She is the queen, and the queen does not travel without people knowing where she is, except this time she did. On the second day, the yacht moved from its original anchorage to a more exposed position further along the coast. The reason for the move has never been explained, but the result of it was that the yacht was now visible from other vessels in the area and from at least 2 points on the shoreline. That is not a mistake that a professional security team would allow. The photographer was not a professional paparazzi. That is the first thing that the palace got wrong when it tried to manage the fallout. The images were taken from a neighboring vessel by someone who recognized her and understood exactly what they were looking at. The photographs showed Camilla on the upper deck of the yacht, dressed in a way that suggested she had no expectation of being observed, laughing with her head back, a glass in her hand, surrounded by guests whose presence alongside a sitting queen raised questions that the palace had no good answers for. One photograph in particular showed her leaning against the railing in conversation with a man whose face was partially turned away from the camera, and that image alone generated more speculation in 48 hours than most royal stories generate in a year. And this is the detail that reframes everything. The photographs were not sold to the tabloids. They were not auctioned to the highest bidder the way that images of senior royals have been sold in the past. They were sent, directly and without any request for payment, to free media outlets on the same morning. The same Tuesday, the same timestamp on all three emails. Somebody wanted those photographs to land everywhere at once, and they wanted them to land for free. Because free photographs cannot be recalled. A newspaper that pays for an image can be pressured into suppressing it. A newspaper that receives an image as a gift has no financial incentive to give it back. Now follow what that means. Because this is where the story stops being about photographs and starts being about power. Whoever sent those photographs was not trying to make money. They were trying to make sure the photographs could not be stopped. They chose outlets that they knew would publish quickly and without extended legal consultation. They timed the delivery for a Tuesday morning because Tuesdays are when the palace press office is at its thinnest, with the weekly schedule already locked and the senior staff focused on upcoming engagements rather than crisis management. And they sent the photographs for free, because free photographs cannot be recalled. A newspaper that pays for an image can be pressured into suppressing it through legal threats or quiet deals. A newspaper that receives an image as a gift has no financial incentive to give it back, and no contractual obligation to honor a request to take it down. The only people who would have a reason to do all of that, who would know exactly which outlets to send them to, and exactly how to time the delivery so that the palace could not get ahead of the story, are people who understand how that institution works from the inside. The palace press office received its first call from a journalist at 8:30 that Tuesday morning. By 9 o'clock, 2 more outlets had made contact. By 10, the story was already being discussed on social media with enough detail that the press office understood it could not be contained. The official response, when it finally came, was a single paragraph stating that the Queen's private time was a personal matter and that the palace would not be commenting further. But inside Kensington Palace, a very different conversation was already happening. Stay with me here, because what was happening inside Kensington in the hours after those photographs went public is the part that nobody has reported. And it is the part that changes everything about what you think this story is. William saw the photographs before the palace press office issued its statement. He saw them because someone inside the system made sure he saw them early, not through official channels, not through the usual chain of communication that runs from the press office to the private secretaries to the principals. Someone sent them directly to a phone that William checks himself, and they sent them with a single line of text that said nothing more than what the images already showed. And his response was not what anyone expected. He did not call the press office. He did not call his father. He did not release a statement or ask for a briefing or do any of the things that a senior royal is supposed to do when a crisis involving another member of the family becomes public. He sat with those photographs for what sources close to Kensington describe as approximately 2 hours. He did not forward them. He did not discuss them with Catherine. He looked at them, and he thought, and then he picked up the phone and made one call. And it was not to anyone inside the palace. The call went to a law firm in London that specializes in media law and privacy litigation. The firm had represented members of the royal family before, but they had never received a call quite like this one, because William was not calling to suppress the photographs. He was not asking for an injunction. He was not trying to protect Camilla from the consequences of what those images showed. He was not doing what any other member of that family would have done, which is to call the press office and say, make this go away. He was calling to make sure the photographs stayed public. I am going to let that sit for a second. because it is the single most important detail in this entire story. William, the heir to the throne, the man who has spent his entire adult life fighting against the kind of invasive photography that killed his mother, picked up a phone and made a legal decision designed to ensure that invasive photographs of his stepmother remained in circulation. He asked the firm to confirm that the images, as they had been distributed, did not fall under any existing injunction or privacy order that the palace could use to pull them. He wanted to know, in plain terms, whether there was any legal mechanism that could force those photographs off the internet, and when the firm told him there was not, he thanked them and he hung up. He did not make a second call. He did not need to. The photographs were going to stay exactly where they were, and he had just made sure of it. And he did it because he understood something that the rest of the family had not caught up to yet. Section 4. The confrontation. The meeting happened on the Thursday, 2 days after the photographs became public. It was held at Windsor Castle, not at Buckingham Palace, and the choice of location was itself a message that the people inside the room understood without it needing to be said. Windsor is where the family gathers when something is serious enough that the public setting of Buckingham Palace would attract the wrong kind of attention. Windsor is where decisions are made that cannot be walked back. Charles was there, Camilla was there, though she arrived separately and through a different entrance, which the staff noticed and the staff remembered. William arrived on time, which anyone who has worked with him will tell you is the clearest signal he sends when he wants a conversation to go exactly the way he has planned it. There were no aides in the room. That detail has been confirmed by multiple people who were in the building that day. The staff were told to clear the corridor. The doors were closed. And what happened inside that room lasted, by the best account available, slightly under 40 minutes. Now here is where you have to understand what William had been building, because this was not a man who had seen some embarrassing photographs and decided to make a point. This was a man who had spent months, quietly and without telling anyone who might have stopped him, assembling a very specific picture of how the Queen's private life had been managed and mismanaged in ways that created risk for the institution and for his children. The photographs were the opening, but they were not the argument. William laid out, in that room, a timeline. The timeline showed a pattern of private travel by Camilla over the previous 18 months that did not match the official record of her engagements. It showed gaps in the security arrangements that had been approved or not approved by people whose job it was to ensure that the Queen was protected at all times. And it showed connections between Camilla's private circle and individuals whose public profiles made their proximity to the crown a liability rather than an asset. And this is where I keep coming back to, because of what it says about him. He did not raise his voice. Multiple accounts agree on that. He did not make accusations. He did not lean forward in his chair or point a finger or do any of the things that a person does when they are angry and want the other person to know it. He spoke the way a person speaks when they have been preparing for this conversation for a very long time, and they do not intend to waste a single word of it. He presented the information as a set of facts, calmly and in order, and then he made a single request. He asked that Camilla's private schedule be subject to the same oversight that every other senior royal's private schedule is subject to. He asked that her security arrangements be reviewed and brought into line with the protocol that exists specifically to prevent situations like the one those photographs had documented. And he asked that these changes be implemented immediately, not as a negotiation, but as a condition. A condition of what? That is the question that hung in the room. And the answer to it is the reason this story matters. William made it clear, without saying it directly, and without making a threat that could be characterized as such, that the way the monarchy presented itself to the public in the coming years would depend on whether the institution could demonstrate that it held everyone to the same standard. And that if it could not demonstrate that, if the Queen was allowed to operate outside the framework that bound everyone else, then the public's trust in the institution would erode in a way that no amount of ceremony could repair. The silence after William finished speaking lasted long enough that one of the people who heard about it afterward said it was the kind of silence where you start studying the pattern in the carpet, because looking at anyone's face would feel like taking a side. Charles did not respond immediately. He asked one question. He asked William whether he had discussed this with anyone else. William said no. He said this was between the three of them and he intended to keep it that way as long as the situation was handled. Camilla said nothing during the meeting, not one word. She sat, she listened, and when it was over, she left through the same entrance she had used to arrive. A car was waiting. She did not speak to anyone in the corridor. And in that silence, in that refusal to defend herself or explain or push back against a single thing William had said, the shape of what had just happened became clear to everyone who understood the family well enough to read it. William had not just confronted Camilla about some photographs on a yacht. He had drawn a line. And the line was not about privacy or security or protocol. The line was about who this family was going to be when the cameras were not rolling, and whether the woman who wore the crown was going to live inside the same rules as everyone else, or whether she was going to continue operating as though the rules did not apply to her. Section 5. The consequence. Within 2 weeks of that meeting at Windsor, 3 things changed. Each one was quiet. Each one was permanent. The first was a restructuring of the Queen's private office. 2 members of Camilla's personal staff, people who had been with her for years and who had managed her private schedule with an independence that the rest of the household had always found unusual, were reassigned. They were not dismissed. They were moved to positions that carried the same title and the same salary, but none of the access. The reassignment was handled internally, and no announcement was made. The second change was the security review. A formal assessment of the Queen's travel and protection arrangements was ordered, not by the King and not by the Home Office, but by the Kensington office in coordination with the Metropolitan Police. The review was comprehensive. It covered every private engagement Camilla had undertaken in the previous 12 months, and when it was completed, the recommendations it produced were not optional. The third change was the quietest and the most significant. Camilla's public schedule for the following quarter was expanded, not by much, but by enough that the gaps which had previously allowed for unaccounted private travel were filled with engagements that required her presence, her visibility, and her availability to the press. The schedule was designed, and everyone who looked at it understood this, to make it very difficult for the Queen to disappear for 5 days without anyone knowing where she was or who she was with. William did not claim credit for any of it. He made no public statement. He gave no interviews. He did not brief any journalist, and anyone who asked his office about the situation was told that the Prince of Wales does not comment on the private affairs of other members of the family. He went back to his own schedule. He attended the engagements he was expected to attend. He stood beside his father at a public event the following week and smiled and shook hands and gave absolutely no indication that anything had changed. But everything had changed. And the people inside that institution knew it. Not just Camilla and not just Charles, but every aide and every advisor and every person who had been watching from the edges of the corridors and wondering whether William was prepared to use the authority that his position gave him when it truly mattered. He was, and the quiet way he used it, the refusal to make noise or claim a victory or let anyone outside the walls of Windsor know what had happened, was itself the clearest possible signal of what kind of king he intends to be, and the reason he was willing to walk into a room at Windsor Castle and tell the Queen that her private life was no longer entirely private, is the same reason he has fought every battle he has fought since he was 15 years old and understood for the first time what had actually been done to his mother. Section 6. The Diana Close, because this is, in the end, a story about Diana. Not because Diana was on that yacht, she was not. Not because Diana would have cared about photographs of Camilla in the south of France, she might have. But because Diana understood, before anyone else in that family was willing to understand it, that the institution would always protect itself before it protected the people inside it, and the people it chose to protect were never the ones who needed protection the most. Diana spent years watching a woman move through the spaces that were supposed to be hers. She watched that woman attend dinners that Diana was excluded from. She watched that woman build a relationship with the man Diana was married to, while Diana was still wearing his ring and still carrying his name and still standing beside him at public events with a smile on her face that cost her more than anyone watching could have understood. She watched the institution close ranks around that relationship, while telling Diana that the problem was her inability to accept what everybody already knew. Follow what that means. Follow what it costs a person to live inside a lie that the entire world can see through and still be told that they are the problem. And when Diana tried to speak about it, when she sat in front of a camera and told the truth about what had been done to her, the institution did not thank her for her honesty. It punished her for it. It stripped her of her title, reduced her security, and made it clear that a woman who tells the truth about the monarchy does not get to remain inside it. The very act of telling the truth became the reason she was pushed out, and the woman who had caused the damage that Diana was telling the truth about was allowed to stay. William remembers that. He was a boy standing in a corridor in Kensington Palace when his mother came home from that interview, and he could see on her face that something had shifted, that whatever protection she had believed the institution owed her was gone. He did not understand it then. He understands it now. And what he did in that room at Windsor Castle, when he sat across from Camilla and laid out the facts and drew the line, was the thing his mother spent her entire adult life wishing someone would do. He held the institution to its own standard. He said, without saying it in so many words, that a crown does not make you untouchable, that a title does not erase what you have done, that the cameras will always find you eventually, and when they do, the question is not whether the photographs can be suppressed. The question is whether the life you are living can survive being seen. Diana could not ask that question. She was not given the time or the standing or the power to ask it. But her son can. And in that room at Windsor, in the silence that followed his words, something shifted that cannot shift back. She would have known exactly what those photographs meant. She would have looked at them and seen, not just a woman on a yacht in the south of France, but the same pattern she had lived inside for 15 years, the private life that the public was not supposed to see, the double standard that the institution maintained because maintaining it was easier than confronting it, the silence of a king who would rather look away than look closely at the woman sitting beside him. She would have recognized all of it because she had been the first person to name it, and naming it had cost her everything, and she would have been proud of her son. Not for the confrontation itself, because Diana never wanted her boys to carry her anger. She wanted them to carry her clarity. She wanted them to see the institution for what it was, and to love it anyway, but to love it honestly. The way you love something you are willing to fix, instead of something you are afraid to look at. William walked into that room at Windsor with evidence instead of emotion. He walked out with a result instead of a wound. And in doing so, he became the person Diana always believed he would be. Not a prince who fights, a prince who sees. The years she did not have were given back to her in the only way they still could be. Through a son who understood what she had been trying to tell the world, and who finally had the authority to make the world listen. Section 7. The call to action. That is where this one lands. Thank you for staying with me through the full story. I know it was a long one, and I know some of what you heard in the last 40 minutes is going to sit with you for a while. It should, because this is not a story that ended when William walked out of that room at Windsor. This is a story that is still moving, still unfolding, and what comes next depends on whether the people inside that palace heard what he was saying, or whether they filed it away in a drawer somewhere and hoped it would go quiet. I do not think it is going to go quiet. And I do not think William intends it to. The changes that were made after that meeting are still in place. The oversight is still active, and the woman who sat in silence while her stepson told her that the rules apply to everyone is still living inside a set of boundaries that she did not choose and cannot remove. There is more coming on this channel before the month is out. I am already working on the next one, and I can tell you right now that what I have found connects directly to what you just heard. The story of what happened on that yacht did not end with the photographs. There is a second chapter to this, and the people involved in it are people you already know. So if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button so you do not miss what follows. And if something in this episode landed for you, if there was a moment where the pieces came together and you felt the weight of what this family is still carrying, I would appreciate it if you hit the like button on your way out. It helps this channel reach the people who care about these stories the way you do, and it tells me that the work is worth doing. I will see you in the next one. Stay with me. There is more to come.